Hello everyone, and welcome to this event, which has the title Climate Finance and Conflict Dynamics on the Road to COP27. My name is Anna Åberg. I am a research associate in the Environment and Society program of Chatham House, and I am absolutely delighted to be chairing today's discussion. Chatham House is hosting this event together with International Alert to mark International Peace Day, which is taking place today. And what we're hoping to do is to take a bit of a deep dive into the interactions between climate finance and conflict. And this is a really timely discussion. We know that some of the people that are absolutely most vulnerable to climate change live in fragile and conflict-affected states. According to the ICRC, 14 of the 25 most climate vulnerable nations live in countries that are experiencing violent conflict. Investing in climate change adaptation is, of course, absolutely critical to reduce climate vulnerability, but implementing adaptation projects and mitigation projects in fragile and conflict-affected states is highly challenging. This is because such projects can have a significant impact on power relations, on political dynamics. They may affect positively or negatively people's livelihoods, access to resources, and assets. So if climate projects aren't designed well, there is a risk that they could amplify existing tensions by amplifying inequalities and grievances, and then contribute to conflict dynamics, which is something we, of course, want to avoid. So to mitigate this risk, it's really important that climate change projects are designed and rolled out in a conflict-sensitive way. This is important not only to minimize the risk of climate change projects contributing to tensions, but also to increase the likelihood of them making a positive contribution to peace. So this issue of conflict sensitivity and climate finance is a really important one. But to date, it is something that remains quite under-discussed in international climate discussions. So with this event here today, what we're hoping to do is to, one, increase understanding and raise awareness of how climate finance, how climate interventions can impact conflict dynamics. Secondly, we're hoping to have a discussion about what can be done to prevent climate change interventions from having a negative impact on conflict dynamics and increasing the likelihood of them making a positive contribution to peace. And finally, we also want to think about opportunities for elevating this agenda as part of the wider climate discussions. COP27 is, of course, just around the corner. And with me here to discuss this today, I'm very pleased to be joined by three extremely knowledgeable panelists. First up, we have Nisreen El Saim, who is the chair of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change. Secondly, we will hear from Albert Sower, who is a senior conflict prevention and recovery expert with the European Investment Bank. And last but definitely not least, we're delighted to be joined by Blaise Mouire, who is a senior researcher with International Alert. And my colleague Annem from Chatham House will post their bios in the chat, so please do feel free to check out their profiles in a bit more detail. In terms of how the session will run, I will start by asking the speakers a few questions to kick off the discussion. And then I'm really hoping that you, the audience, have lots of challenging and interesting questions that you would like to ask our speakers. If you do want to ask a question, please post it in the Q&A box. We're hoping that somebody, so even, regardless if you want to ask it verbally or not, my colleague Adam will reach out to you to check whether you would like to ask it verbally or not. The event will last for 1 hour, and just so you know, it is being live streamed on International Alert's LinkedIn page. It's a joint International Alert Chatham House event, but we're actually not using the Chatham House rule here today. Everything is on the record. Great, I think that's it in terms of logistics. So I will turn to our distinguished panel. Nisreen, I'm going to turn to you first. I was hoping that you could perhaps expand a bit on why you think it is important that conflict considerations are integrated into conversations about climate finance. And then perhaps most importantly, outline some of the key changes that you would like to see in policy and practice when it comes to ensuring greater conflict sensitivity.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone, and happy International Peace Day. I'm very glad to be here with you to speak about this important topic, which is peace. As a person who's coming from Sudan, a country that suffered from conflicts, from colonialism, from civil wars for many years, and unfortunately still happening in many places where the conflict actually caused a lot of losses, not only in assets and finance, but of course in lives. And it destroyed the very little infrastructure we have, and takes a huge part of the country budget of our GDP to actually the peace and to maintain fragile peace, because the answers and the solution does not really address the root causes of the conflict in the first place. It's very important for me to speak about this topic because I know I can connect the dots, and I'm sure also the audience can understand how not having a stable, peaceful country can have implications and affect the development of the same country. How can we have education in places where wars can happen at any moment? How can we have a health system in a place that doesn't have hospitals in the first place, because most of the hospitals were turned into shelters for the IDPs and the refugees from the neighboring countries? How can we talk about infrastructure itself if we can bomb or at least have a conflict in the area at any moment and any second? Everything is interlinked together. If there is a conflict, then people will flee, then there is no agriculture, then there is a huge insecurity when it comes to food, a huge insecurity when it comes to possibility of having a conflict in the first place, because we cannot make sure that the host community will be welcoming as their resources also impeding. It's also very dear to my heart to speak about the relationship between climate change and peace and security, because I've seen it everywhere, every day almost of my life, how climate change is causing conflict. Yet it's not reflected enough. It doesn't actually been seen or heard or have any text on climate change, peace and security, not in the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and there was a huge push to have a resolution at the Security Council of Climate, Peace and Security before it vetoed. I am glad that we took forward steps by the declaration and the resolution that finally adopted climate change and clean environment as a human rights in the General Assembly 2 months ago. And of course, the very first and the very important and the very basic human right is the right to live. If anything is going to take your life, then you cannot talk about other human rights. So actually, climate change is not only a threat and alarm for peace and security, it's also a threat and alarm for the human security. And if it's a threat and alarm for the lives of the human security, then of course it's a threat for a huge violation for human rights. Before I finish my intervention, I always say, and I keep repeating it, that we have peace builders and we have climate activists. Climate advocates, people who actually build the capacities of their communities, help their communities to adapt with climate change, build the resilience so they can actually absorb the impacts of the climate change, are not peace builders, although we do a lot of similarities. Actually, climate advocates are conflict preventers. We prevent conflict from happening in the first place, and that's how we always say prevention is better than cure. It's cheaper, it's life-saving, it's more development-oriented path for things. So please join hands between peace builders, climate advocates, to stop conflicts in the first place, and also relive and build the peace post the conflict in places where have already conflict happening, like Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia, and many other countries. Thank you very much. And again, I'm very happy and glad to be here with you today.
Thank you so much, Nisreen, for that powerful statement. I really agree with what you said, that climate activists are conflict preventers. I was actually hoping to ask you a follow-up question also, wondering a bit about how global youth coalitions are working to elevate the profile of this issue globally in a different forum.
Yes, so there is the coalition of youth, peace and security. There is also a huge push now to talk about peace and human peace and security, especially after the Ukrainian war. And why? And the link and relationship is as follows. Climate change causes conflict directly by either conflicts over natural resources, water, food, etc., because the resources are impeding due to the weather variability and the climate change impacts, or it causes people to flee to other places, what we call them climate migrants, and this migration would be internal or external. So the host community can be unwelcoming, so another conflict can happen. But the new introduction of how climate change can actually cause wars is what happened in Ukraine. Now, most of the world, especially the European continent, buy gas and oil from Russia. And we always say that buying fuel, it means that you are fueling war. And that's why shifting to renewable energy is very important, not only for the environment, not only for the atmosphere, not only for climate change, but also to maintain peace and security. So working in both sectors, both ways, the direct impact of climate change, as I mentioned earlier, the conflicts between the pastors and the farmers, the conflict between the people who actually migrated because of droughts or because of flood to another community who was not very much welcoming, the conflicts that can happen over resources, and again also the conflicts that might happen because some countries have a lot of power and energy power and money because of fossil fuel and brown energy, as they like to say it. And both ways are very important to be working on to avoid conflict and to build peace.
Thank you very much, Nisreen. Albert, I'm going to turn to you now. You are currently working for the European Investment Bank, which is one of the world's main financiers of climate action. What is the EIB doing to ensure conflict sensitivity is integrated in its approaches? And what are some of the main challenges you face?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be part of this team here at this seminar. Yeah, for the European Investment Bank, I think there are two big policy frameworks within which the bank is operating, which is, of course, the climate roadmap that the bank developed to implement and its ambition to be Europe's climate bank, meaning that all action that the bank is financing is aligned to the Paris Agreement. And within the Paris Agreement, and there is attention for the specific, let's say, circumstances of fragility and conflict. Second big policy framework that is important for the bank is the European Union's NDC, which is the strategy for the European Union development assistance outside the European Union. In that strategy, there is equally quite some attention to fragility and conflict in the different areas. Thirdly, the bank just endorsed last week the European, the bank's strategic approach to fragility and conflict. And that strategy or strategic approach outlines how the EIB will tackle fragility and conflict in its work, and it will be published very soon on the website. Now, in more practical terms, and there is a lot of analytical work that is being done, and the main parts of it is on the European Commission side, and then of course the EIB is part of that work, and there are country level conflict assessments being implemented and that the IAB participates in. Where needed, EIB can implement additional assessments. Secondly, and that is quite unique, the EIB runs a conflict sensitivity help desk, which is helping the individual projects to come to terms with the context in which they are working, especially those that are affected by conflict, and how to shape the projects to respond well to that situation. And that is all working under the basic premise of do no harm and where possible have a positive impact on peace. Now you come back to the second part of your question is on the challenges, and that's a big question. There is a lot that that might be mentioned. I think there are a number that in this specific seminar might be interesting. And the first one is that I think most agencies that that are working in international development, whether they are more development agencies or investment banks, is that we all find it very challenging to ensure a solid understanding of the context and the risk environment in which we are working. A single agency simply cannot bring all the resources, skills, competencies, and networks to the table that are needed to permanently be abreast of the developments in each individual setting where we are operating. What it does, and most agencies agree, what it does is that we need partnerships to get to terms with it. A single agency cannot pretend to be able to do that kind of work. Secondly, and also Nasrim mentioned it very strongly, there is an increasing call to focus on conflict prevention. That's fine, that's good. The logic is there. What it means is forward-looking analytics in each of the individual settings, and this is very complicated, especially when we deal with systemically complex environments which are characterized by very low levels, very high levels of uncertainty and very high levels of unpredictability. It means that the strength of our analytics in predicting what will happen and what will be the impact of our actions is very limited. And that means that we permanently need to update our analysis to have an almost real-time insight in what is working and what are the systemic changes that we are looking at and to which we need to respond. Complicated. Also, we still have a limited understanding what really works in terms of conflict prevention. And we have theory, the underlying evidence behind it, or the evidence behind it, that theory is still a little bit thin. So we need more work on that one. Another one that I think is for many agencies complicated is that we have an increasing narrative of development that is very context specific, very holistic in approach, and focusing on interconnectivity of all these different development themes, which means that these different development themes cannot be understood in isolation. And whether we talk about conflict, fragility, gender, climate change, it's all more one way or the other interrelated and interconnected. At the same time, most of the different agencies, whether it is from the historic foundational origin where they come from, internal capacities or whatever, we tend to focus on specific themes and not cover everything. This is somewhat unavoidable, and trying to do everything at the same time is unlikely to be successful. But what it means is that each time the systemic change that we are hunting for and that we are aiming for with our projects is influenced by actors and processes that are outside the direct scope of what we are doing, of our concerned project. And again, what it means is that we are only doing, as an individual agency, part of the show. What it urges for and what it pushes for is partnership development with other agencies in complementary and synergistic action. Maybe a last thing that I would mention here is that from an investment bank point of view, the market conditions in fragile and conflict settings are very challenging, and the markets are small, and with limited business opportunities for the size that most of the MDBs are looking for, and let's say $20 million and up. That kind of investment opportunities are very limited, and that for an investment banking, that is a problem. The context and the markets are not very transparent. Often you have all kinds of governance and rule of law issues, which makes it a risky environment to invest in. Local partners that would receive the investment and take on the loans, they often find it complicated to work with admittedly a myriad of standards and regulations that international financing bodies are applying in their work. Now, there may be all kinds of good reasons for all these standards and the environment, social and government standards, and all kinds of regulations, and there may be good reasons for it. It's not very well aligned. If you look at all the different agencies with the different standards, and for local partners, it is very complicated to comply with all that, which in turn makes it for the international investments complicated to invest. Also, these contexts, as I said earlier, they are very complex, and that means that it is the changes in the market structure are a bit unpredictable, but they also can be very frequent and very fast. And that requires adaptive arrangements from the investment agencies to such circumstances. And that is not easy to manage in those settings. And these market conditions, they push transaction costs up, which makes it more expensive to work. In the bank, somebody said, 90% of my lending portfolio sits in the EU, but 90% of my work in all due diligence and managing the loans sits outside of the EU, meaning 90% of the work goes to 10% of the investments. That means transaction costs are high, and this needs to be tackled. Otherwise, increased investment will be very difficult to mobilize. A link to that is, most of the agencies that I've talked to, they do agree that the regular business as usual doesn't work, and that adaptation is needed. And a lot of agencies do invest in innovation, in product design and what have you, but still, it is complicated, challenging to develop products and instruments and management arrangements that are flexibly adaptable to the market realities that we are looking at. It is not easy for a loan for infrastructure investments with large amounts of loans that have complicated contracting arrangements behind it to make that very flexible in its implementation. It is difficult, and you cannot do that very easily in very different ways in the different contexts at the same time. You need a certain level of stability internally in the organization to remain manageable. So that is difficult to manage, and I think that is a challenge for most of the agencies that we are that are concerned with this. Most of the agencies agree that there is a need for more agile type of management arrangements. To translate that into more practical arrangements is complicated. That's it.
Yeah, Albert, thanks so much for that. That's so interesting. And I have tons of follow-up questions, but I am aware that time is passing quickly, and we do want to enable a lot of time for audience Q&A. So I will turn to Blaise now, who has done interesting work in the DRC around the energy transition and conflict. Well, sorry. Around the energy transition and how that links to conflict. Albert, Blaise, I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about this research that you have done and what some of the key messages are that are emerging.
Thank you very much, Anna. Sorry for my voice. So it's a pleasure to be here. So thank you for having me. So the energy transition will definitely rely on the strategic minerals, so the cobalt and the lithium, especially. But the challenge that we have at the global scale is when these minerals are located in a fragile state, right, where issues of governance are being posed. So this is why Congo is a good example as being at the heart of this global project of energy transition, while at the same time the issues of governance in the mining sector are posing some issues for the future of energy transition. So this is one of the motivations that have led this research in Congo and other countries. But I'm going to talk specifically for DRC, but with very similarities with other countries. So I'm going to point out maybe 5 points which can summarize, give the picture of the issues of the conflicts at the local level. So let me start by the issues of governance. So the first land code, which is the mining law, so to say. So the initial law was in 2002, and with a lot of discussion with civil society actors and the private sector, it was revised in 2018. And one of the greatest feature in this revision was to recognize the artisanal cooperatives to be part of this project of exploitation of cobalt. So what we have noticed during our research is, although there is this sort of recognition of the cooperative, artisanal cooperatives to work alongside, foreign companies in industrial exploitation, there is a lack of a political will to make this cooperative work. So basically you have a number of artisanal cooperatives operating within the site which has under license of these multinational companies. So there is a clash in how far these cooperatives can go and how can even local cooperatives negotiate the price at the local level. So the other issue in regard to these governance issues is the law also gave the possibilities to find out other areas where the artisanal exploitation can be done. But the problem is to find out viable areas where local communities, through their cooperatives can work. So viable site means we're making sure the government will make sure that there are possibilities also, to dig and to get something out of that, and maybe to negotiate the price of the local market. So many of the cooperatives we met in the field said that these viable areas for exploitations are not given so far, so which is a problem. So we have a number of tensions which are opposing diggers to industrial companies, because many of these cooperatives actually are finding hard to negotiate, even to extend their activities. So the second aspect, or maybe the second point, is what we call the preponderance of mining activities over agricultural activities. Basically, in the Congo, in the legal framework, this is not only in the cobalt sector, but the mining law in general. It is said that once we have the license, for mining exploitation, and this license is, let's say, 1 hectare, 20 kilometers square, it means that you have the exclusive right to use that land for the mining activities, regardless the people, the communities who are using that land for agricultural activity for their livelihoods. So this is an issue. And this debate exists, and it causes a lot of tensions and conflicts. So many of the communities in different areas in the Congo are coming together and develop some self-defense mechanisms where we have an increasing number of armed groups in different mining areas. So the third point is because of the expansion of cobalt exploitation across the country in these particular provinces in the southeast of Congo, we are going to notice the changes in the land use and the land access, because many families, or in small cities, are going to be somewhat expropriate, and they will be able to negotiate with local authorities whether they can leave their land, for international companies for some compensation. But there are some examples of in some critical areas, where international companies have put the pressure on local governments that they are willing to work. So we are going to witness hundreds of thousands of families that will be expelled from these locations for their homes. And the absence of the focused plan to deal with these challenges is going to create tensions. I will share with you a short quote when I met one of the key informant. He's an official who has been working in mining sector for more than 20 years. And he told me this: we are very much concerned by the relocation of families who are forced to leave their homes and settle in non-viable sites without access to basic facilities. We are afraid that the community response will be fatal and counterproductive for all, including foreign companies that are investing in cobalt here. Local frustrations will ultimately lead to the rise of local militias against these companies. This is what he told me. Let me move to the fourth point, and this also is, related to the issue of governance. It's the unfair pricing of cobalt in the value chain. So the price is basically imposed locally by foreign companies to artisanal cooperatives. So regardless how long you spend your time, in the mining site, and regardless the quantity, the quality and the price are going to be fixed by those intermediaries of international companies in the area. So that's an issue. So there's a growing frustrations of these diggers whose families are affected very much by these unfair price negotiations. So, and at the same time, there is no any local mechanism to regulate, and whereby the government should be involved in to address these issues, So the diggers and families who are involved in artisanal mining are somehow abandoned to themselves. And there is no mechanism so far that can help them to negotiate their price. And the last point is relying solely on the mining sector without diversifying and promoting other economic sectors will be having a negative impact on the cohabitation between communities. Basically, in this part of the country, cobalt is having some expansions. There is international pressure. The global market is affecting local market. And at the same time, because there is no other possibilities for the communities to survive, they are all relying, on the mining sector. But given this governance landscape, we have hundreds and thousands of families who are moving from other districts, who are being attracted, to those areas where the mining sector is having a boom. So now the problem is, when we talk about conflict dynamics, is that when you have this demographic pressure, people coming in small areas and from different areas. So we have this emerging voice of native and non-native. So there are some communities who are trying to defend their right to land and to the mining site by using this narrative of we are the owners of these resources. You are not from here, and it's. I mean, even through social media, it's like a hate speech going on right now because there is this rush, the people who are looking for opportunities. So at the same time, cobalt and other minerals are attracting also regional markets. So it's not only global versus local. And so it's maybe to finish.
Yeah, great, super.
Yeah, maybe to finish, I'd say to say that the shift towards green energy will definitely rely on these minerals. But this shift at the international level will also produce rapid changes at the country level. Unfortunately, very little attention is being paid to conflict dynamics embedded in this global supply chain. And I hope there is an opportunity to advocate for responsible investment that should be able to take into consideration these complexities. And here we're talking about complex sensitive approach. And so I'll be glad to answer to some questions. And thank you very much.
Super, thanks so much. And thanks to everybody in the audience who've started submitting questions. We'll try to get through as many of those as possible. I'd like to start by reading one from Emily Brook. Excuse me if I'm sorry if I pronounced that in the wrong way. And it's about this partnership and this collaboration that Albert spoke about earlier. And it's to you, Albert. How can international investors and banks like the EIB work with the local businesses / the private sector in climate vulnerable and conflict affected countries to build partnerships that that can help to address climate security challenges? Are there some existing examples to highlight? So yes, in essence, it would be great if you could expand a bit on this partnership issue. Thank you. Albert?
Yes, no, I'm muted. Yeah, there is a lot moving in the market, let's say, of all the different agencies that are working on investment in climate change, but also climate change and combine that with fragility and conflict. And it's interesting. There is a big move with the major IFIs or MDBs in the context of ARIA, which is a collaborative arrangement with different IFIs to promote investment in fragile and conflict-affected settings and to stimulate more cooperation between the IFIs. There is a very encouraging development around investment modalities for peace and come to terms with exactly the issues and challenges that I outlined earlier, where due diligence costs are very high, transaction costs are very high, where market intelligence is very expensive to get and very difficult to get, where in fact we only can crack the nuts if there is a much stronger, let's say, convergence and collaboration between the international agencies. There's a very good initiative that is called also Investment for Peace, with establishing a peace investment fund or facility almost, which is supported by the German government and which is presently under development, will be presented in, 20 October, I think there will be a presentation of the work that is being done. And I think there are a number of this kind of initiatives, and that's good, and that is happening. Individual arrangements with private sector to stimulate investments are still a little bit rare, and this is partly because there are only few big international companies having a dedicated investment strategy for conflict and fragile settings. It's haphazard. It's there. They want to invest or they don't, and there is not a real strategy behind it. What is more importantly from our perspective as investment bank is how to tackle the arrangements on a local level. And what I said is that the market is very small in a sense that the individual loans that are possible in the market are very small, and that needs to be tackled. There needs to be some kind of aggregation arrangement to allow larger funding streams to move into fragile and conflict affected settings, and that requires solutions on a local level, not so much on the international level. That can be managed with all kinds of trust funds, bonds, and what have you to accumulate the financing. But then it is the secondary, the stream into the individual settings or conflict affected countries, which is complicated to manage. And there we need solutions on how the local market can be, how do you call it, managed in a sense to gain access to the available financing. Already it is difficult to spend the money that is there. So let alone if there is much more money flowing into those settings, then the pressure on the market to actually spend will become very, very complicated to manage. So we need localized solutions to manage the investment streams.
Super, thank you so much. There is now a question from Mark Cliff, who I will ask you, Nisreen, to answer if that's okay. He writes, I'd be interested in the panel's view on the impact of the war in Ukraine on climate finance. And when you answer that question, Nisreen, I also wanted to ask you if you could perhaps provide a few reflections on COP27, which is of course just around the corner. What concrete opportunities you see at that conference for elevating this agenda? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, me and a collection of different organizations and civil society movements and young activists are actually trying to make peace and security one of the top agenda and one of the centric themes at this COP in Sharm el-Sheikh. I think one of the very important steps that we need to take right now is to first of all come all of us together and plan for not only the next COP, but the pre-sessions and the pre-discussions that we can have leading to COP27. There is many agenda items at this COP, and all of them are very much linked to peace and security somehow. Yet it's not like a formal agenda item, nor one of the key areas. For example, the COP presidency have theme days, and peace and security doesn't even have a thematic day. But I know that there is a big movement in this sector, and people are trying to gather together. The second thing is we will also try to very much fight to have not a resolution, because in climate change convention it's more of a text and agenda items, the means of implementation in climate change, even if it's just paragraphs regarding peace and security, to be able to reflect and to reference the paragraphs that we will be having on peace and security in the negotiation text. Third, unlocking climate finance, which is one of the topics of today. It's the exact topic of today, the relationship between climate finance and peace and security. And this is something one of the previous speakers talked about, that situation of the countries, that the fragile countries, as he described it. I can share an experience with you. We were applying for fund for a project, one of the biggest funds, and the project was very perfect. It was very articulated. They, even them as organizers or as a committee of the fund, they liked it, but they requested a call with us in like a virtual call. So the main topic that we discussed in that meeting was actually the status of Sudan as a country. They said it's a gambling to implement this project in Sudan, especially that it's a big project and very long term. Anything can happen at any moment. Managerially, it will be very hard to manage the situation, etc., etc. So I asked them a very big question: is this fund exist to be managerially perfect, or it exists to actually help people to adapt to climate change? If it's there to help the people to adapt to climate change, then people who are in fragile and unstable countries are the most vulnerable to climate change, because they have double vulnerability. They are vulnerable to climate change as nature, as food security issues, as floods, as droughts, etc., etc. but they are also having a peace and security issue in the first place because their country is not stable, politically not stable, peace-wise or safety-wise not stable. Then these people are the most worthy to invest in them, to invest in building their capacities, invest in raising their awareness, invest in making them understand how climate change is going to impact them so they can at least find their way out of it if we cannot help them. Why are we caring that much about the logistics, about the office work of the funds if the funds are not actually reaching the people who actually need it? The people who actually suffer every day, every second, not only from climate change, but from their own governments, from their own situation in their own countries. Secondly, how people are reacting to the conflicts over natural resources, or the conflict that was caused by peace and security, by climate change, I mean. They react as it's a normal thing, which is even a bigger threat. They don't communicate to the government. If there's a government, I mean, as a Sudanese, I know that we don't have like a proper government for almost 10 months now. They don't communicate it to the agencies that works. They don't even communicate it to many organizations. For example, in Sudan, we had UNAMID, which is a peacekeeping mission, and this peacekeeping mission had zero knowledge, zero interest, and zero mandate on climate change. They only were there to just keep the peace. But how can you keep the peace if the peace is actually, if the disruption of the peace is caused by something you don't have a mandate on? And this is something the UN Peace and Security Unit actually took note of. Very late for Sudan because we don't have a peacekeeping mission anymore, but at least they are trying to fix things for Iraq, for Somalia, for South Sudan, where they integrated the climate change specialist within the unit of the peacekeeping so they can actually tackle climate change. Regarding the question of the Ukrainian situation, the Ukrainian situation, yes, in the G7 meeting and the G20 meeting, the G7 countries and the G20 countries made it very clear. They promised trillions. In Glasgow, the language was not for climate finance was not billions, it was trillions. But this was before Ukraine. Suddenly, after the Ukrainian situation, the language of billion disappeared, and they were not hiding it. They said very clear, we have a situation now. Ukraine will need a lot of money and a lot of support. Our countries, in order to at least lower the dependence that we have on the gas and the oil from Ukraine, we need a lot of support. Winter is coming. We still didn't recover from COVID. Of course, climate finance will be impacted. And this is a huge mistake because while the Ukrainian war is happening, climate change is also happening. Climate change doesn't stop or have pause just because there's a war here or there's a conflict there. It's continuing. And what we are witnessing now in Pakistan, in Sudan, in South Sudan, in other countries, the devastating floods that we had is a very clear answer for that and very clear evidence for that. We had fires in Italy, in France, all over Europe. We had one of the hottest summers this year. It's also a huge evidence for that. Climate change doesn't stop because something new happened. They happened together. We had the COVID for 2 or 3 years, countries were in lockdown. Climate change did not stop also. Climate change was continuing. So lowering the priority of climate change and climate finance because of other new things that came up is, for me, pure stupidity, because other things that come up does not stop climate change. We need to find finance for both. Polluters must pay, as the Secretary General mentioned yesterday at the opening of the General Assembly, and the historical responsibility of the countries who actually made these emissions, who caused climate change, should be tackled anytime, and whatever happens new doesn't undo what happened in the past. So countries should take the responsibility and start acting and start putting money on table.
Thank you very much, Nisreen. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. Before I give you all of the panelists a final opportunity to make some final comments, I'd just like to turn briefly to my colleague, Armida van Rie from the International Security Program to provide some reflections on what she's heard here today. Armida, do you want to come in?
Thanks very much, Anna, and thanks very much to International Alert as well for helping us to put this panel on. It's been a really interesting discussion so far, and I've really enjoyed hearing all of your reflections and thoughts and comments and questions, of course, from the audience. Perhaps just very, very briefly, a couple of thoughts from me. The first, kind of with my international security hat on, the first is that I'm really struck by the emphasis Albert and Nisreen in particular have put on conflict prevention and climate action as a way of preventing conflicts. That's something we have been doing some thinking about as well within the International Security Program. But it's quite striking to me how we're more broadly moving to this broader definition again of conflict prevention and moving beyond just kind of early warning systems and this narrow definition that we really saw since the 1990s, and are starting to think about climate development and just other elements that can constitute conflict prevention. So that's just an observation. Perhaps I've got a couple of, I guess, questions which I don't think we'll be able to tackle today, but I did wonder about, as I was listening to you speak, so Albert, your point of partnerships, Nisreen, your point around the different communities that will be affected, and Blaise, your point around kind of the lack of political will and things like that. And governance issues, I did wonder how we can develop a coherent approach to, or rather between different stakeholders who are involved in the different moving parts on this. So, you know, when we're talking about the communities, governments, both in countries that have rich minerals, but also in Europe, the European Commission, which Albert talked about, investors, how we can together develop a more coherent approach to conflict-sensitive green energy projects effectively, because that's what we're talking about here. And then also a thought about specifically what incentives we can develop to help tackle some of the governance issues that Blaise raised, which I think you know, drive some of this ultimately. So those are just some kind of reflections and bigger questions, which again, I don't think we'll be able to fully unpack right now, but I hope that's helpful. And thanks again very much.
Thank you very much, Armida. I will now, before closing off this event, give the panelists one final chance to respond each. Great if you keep your intervention to approximately 2 minutes max. It would be great if you could respond to, well, if you have any thoughts on what Armida has said, and potentially respond to some of the questions she asked about incentives and developing a more comprehensive approach. And please, my apologies to the audience for not having been able to cover all your questions. Panelists, when you deliver your final remarks, please feel free to pick up on any of the elements in the Q&A chat that we have not been able to cover. As I see, for instance, there are a few related to the DRC. And I will turn to you first, because you went last in the first round.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you, for your contributions. And I would like to say that no one is going to stop the rush, you know, for these strategic minerals. They are key to energy transition, of course, but ignoring the context or the conflict settings within the countries where we are targeting these minerals is going to be counterproductive. Of course, billions of money will be invested, but the question is it for the sake of business, or are we going to involve local communities and give it the possibilities for them to negotiate their livelihoods? Is it a win-win business at the global scale? So my answer is there is a need for this win-win approach through conflict sensitivity that we have to emphasize. Everyone at different opportunities we have to talk. I mean, those of you who will attend the COP27, that's my message. And when it comes to the finance, I think I mentioned at the beginning of this week. There was a strategic meeting to prepare the COP27. And so the chairperson of the African Union at the end of the meeting was so disappointed, and he said, polluters have promised a lot of money, as Nasrin said, but what they are willing to give, we are not even sure that we give it, is very insignificant. So how do we make investors responsible and to make them actors for positive change in conflict prevention in the areas where they are doing their business? So that would be my last word. And let me again thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Blaise. Albert, I'll go to you next. Please provide any comments you have on Amida's questions, any final takeaways you want to give. And there was also a question about monitoring and evaluation and its role in increasing our kind of understanding in this field. So feel free to pick up any of those that you find most relevant.
Yeah, there is a lot. I can't do that in 1 or 2 minutes. Maybe just people who want to contact me, please feel free and write me on email. I will put my email somewhere in the Q&As so that we can do it offline. Now, there is a lot of worries, of course, in what can be, what is on the table, what can be done, what cannot be done. Now, I am not that negative. If you look at the developments over the last, 10 years or so, I do believe we see a big move towards convergence between the international agencies and all kinds of people that are debating in the development sphere and around climate change and conflict sensitivity and all that. There is convergence in understanding the context and what is needed. Now, that means that on strategic, theoretical level, we are all moving into the same direction, whether it's private enterprise or whether it is investment banking or whether it is more the regular development organizations. There is convergence there. And that is a good thing. There are lots of initiatives ongoing in the innovative field on financing arrangements, deployment structures of projects, in merging, blending structures, and what have you. And there is a lot of good developments in data availability and harmonization of data. It's critical. If you don't have data, you cannot analyze structurally, and you permanently will discuss definitions instead of understanding of context. And the CRAFT initiative, the Strata initiative of UNEF, and CRAFT, or the bigger UN data harmonization. There's collaborative arrangements on the road like ARIA, and that pushes agencies together. Now, what is needed is that we do find ways in which we can translate this convergence in understanding context, in understanding what might work, what might not work in solution design, that it is translated into operational work processes that individual agencies handily can use. Because the risk that we have is that we have an increasing gap between operational capabilities of organizations and theoretical construct and strategic direction that we portray in our documents on complexity and what have you, which is demanding for agile management, but who actually can implement it. So we have a bit of a gap, and I think that gap is widening. Where the attention should go is into operationalizing. What does it mean in very practical terms to invest in high-risk investment environments where there is a big uncertainty on future developments where predictability is very low? What does it mean? What does it mean in practical work, in project preparation, in security arrangements, in guarantees, in type of financing, type of different support arrangements around and the impact aspirations that we have? That needs to be translated in very practical work processes that organizations can implement. And here we are lacking. And we are focusing collectively on the theoretical and political agenda behind climate change and conflict and fragility, but we are not focusing enough on translating that into very practical arrangements that organizations like the investment banks, like the development organization, can internalize into their work process to actually do it. What does it mean, blending of financing in parallel financing arrangements with grant financing, with TA support arrangements, and more or less commercial investment by private sector within an overall framework of the same type of impact aspirations that are behind it? How do you do this? And that needs to, I think, get higher on the agenda, and then we can make progress. Now, let me stop there.
Super, thank you so much, Albert. Lots of food for thought. Nisreen, you have the last word. Before I give you leave the virtual stage to you, I would just like to highlight for our audience that International Alert has released a new report which is focused on understanding the conflicts risk associated with cobalt mining, solar energy, and wind farms in fragile and conflict affected states, which is what Blaise spoke about earlier. And the link to that report is found in the chat, so please do take a look. Nisreen, over to you.
Thank you very much. I think I will answer a question I had in the Q&A session box, sorry, which is what the international community should do. First of all, the international community should be honest about the problem itself, because until now, unfortunately, a lot of parts of the international community are in a denial of the connection between climate change, peace, and security. Secondly, stop having shallow solutions for deep problems and search for the grassroots causes of the conflict, and stop financing the military, and invest more in building the capacity, in education, in things that can actually be sustainable and sustain the peace itself, not only prevent the conflict from happening temporarily, and then the effect will go by the end of the fund, or by the end of the project, or etc. Now, from this session, I send a call for everyone who is ready to collaborate with me, with other activists who really wants to push for climate peace and security from now until COP27, and of course beyond COP27, to make climate peace and security part of the main agenda of COP27 and other COPs, but also not only the UNFCCC, but the Security Council, the Human Rights Council, and the General Assembly. We are ready. We will be working in different approaches, different holistic approaches, research, youth discussions, movies, storytelling, every way possible to send the message that there is a connection between climate change, peace, and security, and this connection is very obvious and very strong, and it can be solved if we invested right. We will be doing it. So if you want to join me and the collision of other young people and other climate advocates in doing that, please feel free to reach me, and also you can reach the organizers to get my email, my WhatsApp number, and I will also put it in the Q&A box. Thank you, or the chat.
That's great. Thanks so much, Nisreen. Well, we're a few minutes past, so we need to conclude, unfortunately. It feels like we could have continued discussing this all afternoon. A huge thanks to our fantastic panelists. I found the discussion really interesting, lots of food for thought. Very big thank you also to International Alert. It's been great collaborating with you around this event. And finally, thanks to everybody in the audience who took the time to dial in. Thanks for listening, and thanks for all your amazing questions. I hope you have a lovely day. Thank you very much.